In Millfield's industrial district, a grieving widow was about to uncover her husband's deadly secret. What started as sorting through old computer files took a shocking turn when she discovered 15 years of explosive evidence. Celia Chen wasn't your typical bereaved spouse. For decades, she had lived as an environmental engineer's wife, known for her unwavering moral courage. When she found Bobby's encrypted files documenting corporate poisoning, she had no idea she was walking into a conspiracy. Celia's quest for justice would expose how Apex Industries selectively protected favored families while poisoning everyone else's children. What began as grief would become war against industrial murder. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The funeral home's parking lot stretched before Celia like a gauntlet. She wasn't sure she had the strength to walk. Her arthritic fingers gripped the steering wheel of her 15-year-old Honda Civic, the same car she'd been driving when Bobby had first asked her to stay away. 15 years. The number sat heavy in her chest, each year a stone she'd carried alone. Through the windshield, she could see clusters of people in dark suits moving toward the entrance of Morrison's funeral home. Former colleagues from Apex Industries, town officials, neighbors who'd once smiled at her over backyard fences. Now they moved with the careful distance of people who'd chosen sides long ago. The industrial skyline of Millfield rose behind the funeral home like broken teeth. Smokestacks that had once belched prosperity now stood mostly silent, their concrete surfaces stained with decades of chemicals and rain. The Clearwater River, which had given the town its original name before the mills came, ran a peculiar shade of rust brown, even in the autumn light. Progress, Bobby had once called it, back when his eyes still held warmth when he looked at her. Celia checked her reflection in the rearview mirror, smoothing gray hair that had once been auburn. At 77, she carried her years in the careful way of someone who'd learned that dignity was sometimes all you had left. The black dress was simple, appropriate, purchased yesterday from a discount store because she'd given away her good funeral clothes years ago, never expecting to need them for this. The walk to the entrance felt endless. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as she approached. Mrs. Henderson from the grocery store turned away pointedly. Jim Morrison, whose family had run the funeral home for 3 generations, offered a professional nod that held no warmth. These people had watched her marriage crumble from the outside, had seen Bobby grow cold and distant, had witnessed her transformation from Robert Chen's wife to that woman who lived alone in the subsidized apartment complex on Elm Street. Inside, the viewing room was filled with flowers that couldn't quite mask the antiseptic smell of death and preservation. Bobby lay in his casket looking smaller than she remembered, his face peaceful in a way it hadn't been in their final years together. The lines of anger and worry that had carved themselves around his eyes were smoothed away, leaving only the ghost of the man she'd fallen in love with 42 years ago. "I can't believe she had the nerve to show up." The voice cut through the respectful murmur of mourners like a blade. Celia turned to see her son David standing near the front row of chairs, his face twisted with the same bitter expression that had become his default whenever her name was mentioned. At 45, he'd grown into a harder version of his father, the same dark eyes, the same stubborn jawline, but without the compassion that had once tempered Bobby's intensity. "David." She kept her voice steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "I came to pay my respects." "Respects?" His laugh was harsh enough to draw stares from nearby mourners. "You lost the right to respect when you walked out on him. On all of us." The familiar lie hung between them like a wall. She'd stopped trying to correct it years ago, when she'd realized that David needed someone to blame for the family's destruction, and she was the most convenient target. The truth, that Bobby had pushed her away, had grown cold and distant and cruel until staying had become impossible, was too complicated for a 12-year-old boy to understand. Now, at 45, David had built his entire identity around that simplified narrative. "I never wanted to leave." The words escaped before she could stop them, and she immediately regretted the vulnerability they revealed. "But you did." David's voice rose, drawing more attention. You abandoned your family when Dad needed you most, when the company was struggling, when... He stopped abruptly, as if catching himself before revealing something he shouldn't. Celia noticed the hesitation, her old lawyer's instincts stirring despite the emotional turmoil. There had always been gaps in the story of their marriage's end, pieces that didn't fit the neat narrative David had constructed. "Son, please?" Sarah's voice cut through the tension as Celia's daughter approached from across the room. At 42, Sarah had inherited her mother's diplomatic nature and her father's practical streak. She worked as a social worker in the next county, far enough away to maintain relationships with both parents without becoming trapped in their conflict. "This isn't the place, isn't it?" David's eyes never left his mother's face. "She comes here after 15 years, expecting what? Sympathy? Forgiveness? I hope she doesn't think she's getting a penny from Dad's estate." He made sure of that. The cruelty in his voice was precisely calibrated, each word chosen to inflict maximum damage. Celia felt something inside her crumble, not from surprise because she'd never expected anything from Bobby's will, but from the public nature of the humiliation. Every conversation in the room had stopped. Every eye was on her, waiting to see how the abandoned wife would react to being reminded of her place. "I didn't come here for money, David." Her voice was quiet but carried clearly in the sudden silence. "I came because, despite everything that happened between us, your father was a good man who deserved better than what life gave him." For a moment, something flickered in David's eyes. Uncertainty, perhaps, or a fragment of the boy who'd once crawled into her lap after nightmares. But it was gone so quickly she might have imagined it. A good man you couldn't be bothered to support when it mattered. The accusation hit like a physical blow. Celia had spent 15 years wondering if he was right, if she should have stayed and endured Bobby's coldness, his growing paranoia, his gradual transformation from loving husband to distant stranger. The guilt had eaten at her through countless lonely nights, through the struggle to find work at 55, through the slow process of building a life from the ashes of her old one. She looked past David to the casket where Bobby lay in his final piece. What had happened to him? What had changed the man who'd once brought her coffee in bed every morning? Who'd talked for hours about their dreams of making the world better through environmental law and engineering? The Bobby she'd married had believed in justice, in protecting the vulnerable, in leaving the world better than they'd found it. The Bobby who'd asked her to leave had been someone else entirely, suspicious, secretive, cruel in ways that still left scars. "I should go." The words came out as barely a whisper. "Good idea." David's voice followed her as she turned toward the exit. "Try not to make a scene on your way out." But before she could take a step, another voice intervened. "Mrs. Chen?" Celia turned to find Elena Vasquez approaching, her expression carefully neutral. Elena had been Bobby's attorney for the last decade, a sharp woman in her 50s, who'd built a successful practice representing both individuals and local businesses. Celia had met her only once, briefly, during the divorce proceedings when Elena had helped facilitate the paperwork that legally ended their marriage while leaving so many emotional wounds unhealed. "Ms. Vasquez." Celia managed a nod, wondering what the attorney could possibly want with her. "I wonder if we might speak privately after the service. There are some matters regarding your husband's estate that require discussion." David stepped forward, his face flushing. "Whatever you need to discuss about Dad's will can be said in front of the family." "She's not." "Actually, Mr. Chen," Elena's voice carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to managing difficult personalities. "There are specific provisions that require Mrs. Chen's attention. Privately." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Celia felt every eye in the room focusing on her again, but this time the attention carried a different quality. Speculation. Uncertainty. The possibility that the narrative they'd all accepted might be more complicated than they'd assumed. David's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "That's impossible. Dad made it clear. Your father made many things clear in his final instructions." Elena's tone remained professionally neutral, but Celia caught something in her eyes, a knowing look that suggested depths beneath the surface. "But some matters are best discussed in the appropriate setting." The funeral director appeared at Elena's elbow, murmuring about the service beginning soon. The crowd began moving toward their seats, conversations resuming in hushed tones. But Celia remained frozen in place, her mind racing. Bobby had left her something. After 15 years of silence, after the cold indifference that had driven her away, after the systematic exclusion from family events and holidays, he'd remembered her in his will. The possibility sent tremors through assumptions she'd carried for so long, they'd become part of her identity. Sarah appeared beside her, offering gentle support with a hand on her arm. "Mom, why don't you sit with me?" But before Celia could answer, Elena leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that only Celia could hear. "Mrs. Chen, there are things about your husband's death, about his life in recent years, that I believe you need to understand. Things that might change how you see the past." The words sent a chill down Celia's spine. She looked again at Bobby's peaceful face in the casket, at the man who'd become a stranger before becoming a memory. What secrets had he taken to his grave? And why, after all these years of silence, was he reaching out to her from beyond it? As the mourners settled into their seats and the minister began his opening remarks, Celia found herself studying the faces around her with new eyes. Which of these people had known Bobby in his final years? What had they seen that she'd been excluded from? And most unsettling of all, what had Elena Vasquez been waiting 15 years to tell her? The service passed in a blur of hymns and eulogies that painted Bobby as a pillar of the community, a dedicated engineer, a man who'd given his life to improving Millfield's industrial prosperity. But as speaker after speaker rose to praise his memory, Celia noticed what wasn't being said. No one mentioned his family. No one spoke of the personal cost of his dedication. And no one seemed to question why the devoted husband and father they described had died alone, estranged from the people who should have been closest to him. When the final prayer was spoken and the mourners began filing out, Elena caught her eye across the room. The attorney's expression was patient but urgent, as if she'd been waiting years for this moment. Whatever Bobby had left behind, whatever secrets had died with him, Celia was about to learn that her long exile from his life was only the beginning of the story. As she followed the crowd toward the parking lot, passing the industrial landscape that had shaped both their dreams and their destruction, Celia Chen prepared to discover that some inheritances come with a price that makes their value impossible to calculate. The question wasn't what Bobby had left her, it was whether she had the strength to carry the weight of whatever truth he'd been protecting all these years. Elena's law office occupied the second floor of a restored Victorian building on Main Street, its tall windows offering a view of Millfield's struggling downtown. The morning after the funeral, Celia sat in a leather chair that had seen better decades, her hands folded in her lap as Elena arranged papers on her mahogany desk. "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Chen." Elena's voice held the same careful neutrality it had at the funeral home, but her dark eyes carried weight. "I know yesterday was difficult." David arrived 20 minutes late, his irritation evident in every step. He'd dressed in his best suit, the same one he'd worn to the funeral, but his tie was slightly askew, as if he'd been arguing with it. Sarah followed close behind, offering apologetic smiles to everyone in the room. "Can we get this over with?" David dropped into a chair without invitation. "I have to get back to work." Elena nodded, opening a thick folder. Robert's will is straightforward in most respects. The house on Maple Street, along with its contents and the remaining mortgage, goes to David. Sarah receives the cabin at the lake and Bobby's retirement accounts. She paused, looking directly at Celia. "Mrs. Chen, you are named as beneficiary for your husband's personal computer, all external storage devices, and the contents of his home office." The silence that followed was deafening. David's face went through several color changes before settling on deep red. "That's impossible. Dad specifically said, your father was very clear about his wishes." Elena's voice cut through his protest. "The will is dated 6 months ago and properly witnessed." "A computer?" Sarah leaned forward, confusion evident in her voice. "Mom, did you know about this?" Celia shook her head, still processing the information. Bobby's computer. After 15 years of silence, he'd left her his most personal possession, the digital repository of his thoughts, his work, his private world. "There's more." Elena reached for another document. Your husband also left this letter specifically for you, Mrs. Chen. The envelope was cream-colored, her name written across it in Bobby's careful handwriting. With trembling fingers, Celia broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. Celia, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and Elena has followed my instructions. I know you have questions about why I pushed you away, why I became someone you couldn't recognize. The answers are in the files I'm leaving you, but I must warn you, some knowledge comes with a terrible price. You always believed in justice, in protecting the innocent. That fire never dimmed in you, even when I had to extinguish it in myself. I pray you'll understand when you see what I've collected, what I've documented, what I couldn't act on while I was alive. The truth she always sought is finally yours to find. I'm sorry for everything. I'm sorry I couldn't explain. I'm sorry I had to hurt you to keep you safe. Bobby David snatched the letter from her hands before she could react. His eyes scanned the words, his expression shifting from anger to confusion to something approaching fear. What files? What is he talking about? I don't know. Celia's voice was barely a whisper. She felt as if the ground beneath her was shifting, as if 15 years of accepted reality was crumbling. Elena cleared her throat. Mrs. Chen, there's something else you should know. Your husband came to see me regularly over the past 5 years. He was troubled by certain matters. He never gave me details, but he made it clear that the contents of his computer were significant. Significant how? Sarah asked. He said they contained evidence of wrongdoing that could hurt powerful people. He was very concerned about your safety, all of your safety, if the information became public while he was alive. David's hands shook as he handed the letter back to his mother. This doesn't make sense. Dad worked for Apex Industries for 30 years. He was a loyal employee, a company man. What evidence? Evidence of what? Elena's expression grew more serious. I believe that's what your mother needs to discover. But Mrs. Chen, I must caution you. Your husband's paranoia in his final years wasn't entirely unfounded. He believed someone was watching him, monitoring his activities. If he was right, then accepting this inheritance may put you in danger. Celia stared at the letter, Bobby's familiar handwriting blurring through unshed tears. The truth she always sought. He'd remembered that about her, the young environmental lawyer who dreamed of exposing corporate polluters, of making powerful companies accountable for their crimes. That woman felt like a stranger now, buried under years of self-doubt and isolation. Mom? Sarah's voice was gentle. What do you want to do? The question hung in the air. Celia could refuse the inheritance, could walk away and return to her quiet life in the subsidized apartment. She could let whatever secrets Bobby had died with remain buried. It would be safer, simpler, the path of least resistance. But as she looked at her children, David's confusion and fear, Sarah's concern, she realized that walking away wouldn't erase the questions. It would only leave them unanswered forever. I'll take the computer, she said quietly, and whatever else he left me. David leaned forward, his voice urgent. Mom, you heard what Elena said. If Dad was right about being watched, then maybe it's time someone finally shed some light on whatever he was so afraid of. Celia folded the letter carefully and placed it in her purse. Your father spent the last 15 years of his life carrying some burden alone. The least I can do is try to understand what it was. Elena nodded approvingly. I'll have everything delivered to your apartment tomorrow. But Mrs. Chen, please be careful. And if you discover anything that frightens you, call me immediately. As they prepared to leave, Sarah caught her mother's arm. Mom, you don't have to do this alone. Whatever Dad left behind, whatever this is about, I'm here to help. For the first time in years, Celia felt a spark of the woman she'd once been. The fighter, the seeker of truth, the person who'd believed that justice was worth any risk. Bobby's final gift wasn't just a computer full of files. It was the chance to reclaim the part of herself she'd thought was lost forever. The afternoon sun filtered through the dusty blinds of Celia's cramped apartment as she stared at Bobby's computer setup, now occupying most of her small kitchen table. Elena sat beside her, her laptop open, both women facing the digital fortress Bobby had left behind. He was always careful with technology, Celia murmured, running her fingers over the keyboard. Even before everything changed, the main computer required 3 separate passwords. The first attempt, their wedding anniversary, failed. So did Bobby's birthday, and the children's names in various combinations. Elena watched patiently as Celia tried everything she could remember from their shared life. Wait. Celia's voice was barely a whisper. Justice for all. It was his old email password, back when we were fighting the Henderson landfill case together. The screen flickered to life. Bobby's desktop was meticulously organized, folders labeled with cryptic abbreviations that meant nothing to either woman. But one folder stood out. For Celia, when I'm gone. Her hand trembled as she double-clicked it. A video file opened automatically. Bobby's face filled the screen, gaunt and tired in a way that shocked her. This wasn't the Bobby from their marriage, nor even the cold stranger who'd asked her to leave. This was a man carrying an enormous burden. Celia, if you're watching this, then Elena followed my instructions. His voice was hoarse, aged beyond his years. I need you to understand, everything I did, every cruel word, every wall I built between us, it was to protect you from this. He gestured to papers scattered around him, documents covered in charts and chemical formulas. I discovered something at Apex Industries, something that explains why the Clearwater River runs brown, why the cancer rates in Millfield are 3 times the national average, why children in the Riverside district are born with defects the company claims are, quote, genetic anomalies. Elena leaned forward, her expression growing grim. Mrs. Chen, perhaps we should... No. Celia's voice was steady despite the tears on her cheeks. I need to hear this, Bobby continued, his image frozen in pixels of pain and determination. For 20 years, Apex has been dumping industrial waste directly into the groundwater. They knew it was happening, they had reports, they had studies, and they buried every piece of evidence they could find. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The screen shifted to show a document marked Confidential Apex Industries Environmental Impact Assessment. The pages that followed were dense with technical language, but certain phrases leaped out. Acceptable contamination levels exceeded by 400%. Potential liability in excess of $200 million. Recommend immediate cessation of current disposal methods. The date on the report was 15 years old. This is why he changed, Celia whispered. He found out about the cover-up and couldn't live with staying silent. But he couldn't act on it either, Elena added quietly. Not without evidence. Not without proof that would hold up in court. The video resumed with Bobby's face, older and more worn than before. I started collecting everything I could find. Internal memos, test results, correspondence between executives. But the deeper I dug, the more dangerous it became. Thomas Mitchell, Apex's head of security, started asking questions about my computer access. I knew it was only a matter of time before they connected me to the missing files. Celia paused the video, her legal mind beginning to process what she was seeing. Elena, if Bobby had this evidence 15 years ago, why didn't he come forward? Why didn't he contact the EPA or the state environmental agency? Elena's expression darkened. Keep watching. Bobby's next words answered her question. I tried to go through proper channels. I contacted the state environmental office, sent anonymous tips to the EPA, but nothing happened. The reports disappeared. The investigations were quietly closed. I realized that Apex's influence went deeper than I'd imagined. They had people inside the regulatory agencies, politicians in their pocket, judges who owed them favors. The camera panned to show more documents. Correspondence between Apex executives and state officials. Records of campaign contributions. Photos of regulatory inspectors at company-sponsored events. That's when I knew I had to make a choice, Bobby continued. I could blow the whistle and watch my family become targets, or I could play along while building an airtight case. I chose to protect you the only way I knew how, by making you hate me enough to leave. Celia's breath caught in her throat. The cruelty, the coldness, the systematic destruction of their marriage. It had all been calculated to drive her away from the danger he'd discovered. Elena reached over and squeezed her hand. He saved everything, Mrs. Chen. Financial records, internal communications, even recordings of meetings where executives discussed the cover-up. It's all here. The video showed Bobby opening file after file, chemical test results showing mercury levels in drinking water wells, medical records documenting birth defects and cancer clusters, correspondence discussing media management and legal strategies to avoid liability. I've spent 5 years building this case, Bobby said, his image flickering with exhaustion. But I'm 68 years old, and I can feel them closing in. Mitchell's people have been watching me, monitoring my communications. I know I won't live to see justice done. He leaned closer to the camera, his eyes holding an intensity that reminded Celia of the passionate young engineer she'd fallen in love with. But you will, Celia. You have the legal mind, the moral courage, and most importantly, the outsider's perspective they won't expect. You're not an Apex employee. You're not connected to their network of influence. You're the one person who can take this evidence and make it count. The screen went black, then displayed a simple message. Password for encrypted files in evidence folder, Truth for Millfield. Celia and Elena sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of Bobby's revelations settling around them like dust. Finally, Elena spoke. Mrs. Chen, this changes everything. If this evidence is authentic, it could bring down Apex Industries entirely. Celia stared at the computer screen, her mind racing through possibilities and dangers. It also explains why Bobby was so paranoid in his final years, if he was right about being watched. As if summoned by her words, a car door slammed in the parking lot outside. Both women froze, listening to footsteps approaching the building's entrance. Elena moved to the window, peering through the blinds. There's a black sedan parked across the street, she whispered. 2 men in suits. They weren't there when I arrived. Celia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air seeping through her apartment's thin walls. Bobby's digital legacy wasn't just evidence of corporate corruption. It was a smoking gun that powerful people had killed to keep buried. And now those same people knew exactly where to find it. The footsteps in the hallway passed Celia's door without stopping, but the black sedan remained parked across the street for another hour. Elena had left through the building's rear exit, taking with her copies of the most damaging files stored on an encrypted thumb drive. They'd agreed to meet again in 2 days, after Celia had time to process what they'd discovered. But processing proved impossible when every shadow seemed to hide a threat. The next morning, Celia noticed that someone had been through her apartment. Nothing was missing, but small things were wrong. Her coffee mug moved from the left side of the sink to the right. Her mail stack rotated 90 degrees, the bathroom medicine cabinet slightly ajar when she always kept it tightly closed. Professional work, designed to send a message rather than gather information. They knew she had Bobby's files, and they wanted her to know they knew. The phone rang while she was triple-checking her door locks. Sarah's voice carried worry that had deepened overnight. Mom, I've been thinking about what you found yesterday. Maybe you should turn everything over to the police. The police? Celia almost laughed, remembering Bobby's files showing how deep Apex's influence ran. Honey, your father documented 20 years of corruption. If he couldn't trust law enforcement then, what makes you think I can trust them now? Then what are you going to do? The question had haunted her through a sleepless night. Bobby's evidence was devastating, but evidence meant nothing without someone willing and able to act on it. She needed allies who weren't part of Apex's network, people with expertise she lacked. Your father mentioned someone in his files. A drive. James Rivera, he used to work for Apex until they fired him. I'm going to try to find him. Mom, please be careful. If these people killed Dad... Your father died of a heart attack, Sarah. Did he? How do we know that? How do we know anything they told us was true? The question lodged in Celia's throat like a stone. She'd never questioned the official cause of Bobby's death. But now, with evidence of systematic cover-ups and corporate murder stretching back decades, every assumption felt suspect. An hour later, she sat in her Honda Civic outside Rivera Environmental Consulting, a modest office in a converted house near the university. The neighborhood felt safer than her apartment complex. Students walking to class, professors with coffee cups, the normal rhythms of academic life. Dr. James Rivera was younger than she'd expected, perhaps in his early 50s, with graying temples and the kind of intense focus she recognized from her own legal career. His office was cramped with environmental reports, water testing equipment, and photographs of contaminated sites. Mrs. Chen? His voice carried surprise and something that might have been fear. I heard about Bobby's funeral. I'm sorry for your loss. You knew my husband well? Rivera's expression grew guarded. We worked together at Apex years ago. Before they decided, my environmental assessments were too pessimistic for their tastes. Celia studied his face, seeing the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned to weigh every word. Dr. Rivera, I need to ask you something directly. Did Bobby ever share information with you about contamination in Millfield? For a long moment, Rivera said nothing. Then he moved to his office door, checked the hallway, and closed it firmly. Mrs. Chen, why are you asking me this? After 15 years of silence, why now? Because my husband left me files. Video messages. Evidence of what Apex has been doing to this town. She pulled out her phone, showing him a photo she'd taken of one of Bobby's reports. He said you might have additional information. Rivera's face went pale as he recognized the document. Jesus Christ! Bobby kept copies? I told him to destroy everything after they fired me. So you did work with him? Work with him? Rivera sat heavily in his chair. Mrs. Chen, your husband saved my life. When I refused to falsify water contamination data, Apex didn't just fire me. They tried to destroy my career, my reputation, my ability to work anywhere in environmental science. Bobby was the only person willing to testify that my reports were accurate. But you lost your job anyway. I lost more than that. My wife left me. My children stopped speaking to me. I went from senior environmental scientist to running a one-man consulting firm that barely pays rent. His voice carried the weight of years of bitterness. But at least I kept my integrity. And, at least, I'm alive. The emphasis on the last word made Celia's blood chill. Dr. Rivera, are you suggesting that Apex would actually kill people? Mrs. Chen, we're talking about a company that's poisoned an entire community for profit. What's a few individual lives compared to that? He pulled out a filing cabinet and withdrew a folder marked Millfield Cancer Cluster, Suppressed Data. Your husband wasn't the only one who tried to expose this. In 1998, Dr. Margaret Foster, a public health researcher from the State University, published a study linking Apex's operations to increased cancer rates. She died in a car accident 3 weeks later. Celia's hands trembled as she accepted the folder. You think they killed her? I think it's a remarkable coincidence that everyone who gets too close to exposing Apex's environmental crimes seems to suffer tragic accidents. Rivera's voice was flat, factual. Your husband was paranoid in his final years, but maybe he wasn't paranoid enough. What do you mean? Bobby called me 2 months ago, first time we'd spoken in over a decade. He said he'd been documenting everything, that he finally had enough evidence to bring them down. He also said he thought Thomas Mitchell's security team was closing in on him. Rivera moved to his window, peering through the blinds at the street below. He asked me to promise that if anything happened to him, I'd help whoever inherited his evidence. He specifically mentioned you, Mrs. Chen. He said you were the only person he trusted to see this through. And now he's dead. Now he's dead, and you're here with his files, and Thomas Mitchell's people have probably been watching you since the moment you left the funeral home. As if summoned by his words, Rivera's expression changed. Mrs. Chen, we need to leave. Now. She followed his gaze out the window to see 2 men in dark suits approaching the building's entrance. The same kind of men Elena had spotted outside her apartment. Back exit, Rivera said urgently, grabbing a laptop bag and the folder he'd shown her. My car's parked behind the building. They slipped out through a door that opened onto an alley behind the office. Rivera's 10-year-old Toyota started on the second try, and they pulled onto a side street just as the men in suits reached his office door. Where are we going? Celia asked. her heart hammering. "Somewhere we can talk without being overheard." "Mrs. Chen, if you really have Bobby's files, if you have the evidence he spent years collecting, then you're carrying the kind of information that could destroy Apex Industries completely. Isn't that what we want?" Rivera's laugh held no humor. "What we want and what we can survive are two different things. Apex has resources you can't imagine, political connections, legal firepower, and security teams that operate more like private military contractors than corporate protection." They drove in silence for several minutes, taking a winding route through residential neighborhoods that would make following them difficult. Finally, Rivera pulled into the parking lot of a small diner near the highway. "Dr. Rivera, I have to ask, why are you helping me? If this is so dangerous, why not just walk away?" He turned off the engine and looked at her with eyes that carried years of accumulated guilt. "Because 15 years ago, I had the chance to stand up to these people, and I chose to protect my career instead of the community. Because Bobby Chen was braver than I was, and it cost him everything." Rivera's voice grew quiet. "And because every day I don't act, more children in Millfield drink contaminated water, more families bury loved ones who died from preventable cancers, more people suffer for Apex's profits." He pulled out his phone, scrolling through contacts. "Mrs. Chen, there's someone else you need to meet. A journalist who's been investigating Apex from the outside. If we're going to do this, if we're going to expose them, we need someone who can tell the story properly." "A journalist?" "Amanda Torres. She's young, idealistic, and most importantly, she's not part of the local network. She doesn't owe anyone favors, doesn't have family connections to worry about." Celia stared out at the highway traffic, normal people living normal lives, unaware that just a few miles away, an entire community was being slowly poisoned for corporate profit. Bobby had spent 15 years carrying this burden alone, sacrificing his marriage and his family to protect them from the truth. Now it was her turn to decide what she was willing to sacrifice for justice. "Make the call," she said quietly. "Set up the meeting." Rivera nodded, dialing the number. "Amanda? It's James Rivera. I need to see you. Tonight. And bring your recording equipment. I think we finally have the story you've been looking for." As he ended the call, Celia felt the last of her old life slipping away. She was no longer just Bobby's estranged widow, no longer just the woman who'd abandoned her family. She was about to become something far more dangerous to Apex Industries. She was about to become their worst nightmare. Amanda Torres arrived at the diner precisely on time, her press credentials hanging from a lanyard around her neck, and a recorder already visible in her hand. At 28, she carried herself with the confident energy of someone who'd never been told that some stories were too dangerous to tell. "Dr. Rivera," she said, sliding into the booth across from Celia and James. "When you called, you said you had information about Apex Industries. I've been investigating them for 8 months. Celia studied the young woman, seeing something of her younger self in Amanda's fierce determination. "What kind of investigation?" "Environmental journalism thesis," Amanda replied, pulling out a tablet and opening a file labeled Apex Corporate Malfeasance. "I've been tracking patterns of illness in Millfield, cross-referencing them with company operations data, trying to establish causation. But I've hit walls everywhere, sealed court records, missing medical files, sources who suddenly refused to talk." Rivera leaned forward. "Amanda, meet Celia Chen, Bobby Chen's widow." Amanda's eyes widened. "The engineer who died last week?" "Mrs. Chen, I'm so sorry for your loss. I actually tried to interview your husband several times. He always declined." "Because he was protecting information that could have gotten you killed," Celia said quietly. She pulled out her phone, showing Amanda the same photograph that had convinced Rivera. "My husband spent 15 years collecting evidence against Apex. He left everything to me." The young journalist's hands trembled slightly as she examined the image. This is what I've been looking for. Internal documentation of the contamination." "It's more than that," Rivera added. "Bobby documented the entire conspiracy. The cover-up, the political corruption, the pattern of intimidation, and possibly murder used to silence critics." Amanda looked between them, her journalistic instincts warring with dawning realization of the danger. You're talking about a Pulitzer Prize-winning story, the kind that brings down corporations and sends executives to prison. We're talking about the kind of story that gets people killed, Celia corrected. The question is whether you're willing to help us tell it safely. For the next 2 hours, they spread Bobby's evidence across the diner table like pieces of a massive puzzle. Amanda's technological skills complemented Celia's legal expertise and Rivera's scientific knowledge. She showed them how to cross-reference internal Apex memos with public health data, creating a timeline that revealed the scope of the conspiracy. Look at this, Amanda said, pointing to her tablet screen. Your husband's files show Apex knew about groundwater contamination as early as 2003. But here, she pulled up a news article, the company was still publicly denying any environmental impact as late as 2015. Rivera studied a chemical analysis report, and here's why they were confident in their denials. They were bribing the state inspector responsible for water quality testing. Bobby documented payments going back 12 years. Celia felt her old prosecutor's instincts awakening as the evidence patterns became clear. This isn't just environmental crime. It's racketeering, conspiracy, bribery of public officials. If we can prove systematic corruption, we can use RICO statutes to go after their entire organization. But first, we need to survive long enough to present the case, Amanda pointed out. Mrs. Chen, Dr. Rivera told me about the surveillance. How do we know they're not watching us right now? As if in answer to her question, Celia's phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Mom, David's here. He says he needs to talk to you urgently. Something about Dad's work computer. He seems scared. The three of them exchanged glances. It could be a trap, Rivera said. Or David might have information we need, Celia replied. He's worked at Apex for 10 years. He might know things even Bobby didn't have access to. Amanda was already packing up her equipment. Either way, we can't stay here much longer. Mrs. Chen, where can we meet that's safe? My daughter Sarah's house. It's in the next county, and David would have to drive there from Millfield. If he's being followed, we'll see them coming. An hour later, they sat in Sarah's living room while her children played upstairs, the domestic normalcy providing surreal contrast to the conspiracy they were unraveling. David paced by the window, his usual arrogance replaced by genuine fear. Mom, I need to know exactly what Dad left you, he said without preamble. Thomas Mitchell called me into his office this morning. He asked specific questions about family computer access, about whether Dad had shared passwords with anyone. What did you tell him? Celia asked. Nothing. But Mom, Mitchell wasn't just asking. He was threatening. He made it clear that my job, my house, my ability to provide for my family, all depend on my, quote, continued loyalty to Apex's interests. Sarah joined them from the kitchen, her social worker's training evident in how she managed the tense family dynamic. David, what exactly are you saying? I'm saying that for the first time in 15 years, I think Mom might have been right about Dad. David's voice cracked slightly. I've been working in environmental compliance for Apex for a decade. I always wondered why certain reports were classified above my clearance level, why some test results were marked internal use only. He turned to face his mother directly. This morning, Mitchell showed me Dad's personnel file. There were things in there I never knew. Reprimands for exceeding authorized data access. Warnings about inappropriate interest in regulatory matters. A final notation that he was considered a, quote, potential security risk. Rivera leaned forward. David, do you have access to current environmental monitoring data? Some of it. But if I start pulling files outside my normal work pattern, they'll know immediately. Amanda looked up from her laptop. What about your normal work pattern? What do you typically have access to? Water treatment reports, air quality monitoring, waste disposal manifests. David's expression shifted as he began to understand. All the current data that would show whether they're still actively contaminating. That's what we need, Celia said firmly. Bobby's evidence proves historical wrongdoing, but if we can show they're still actively poisoning the community, it becomes an ongoing crime requiring immediate intervention. Sarah, who had been listening quietly, suddenly spoke up. David, what about your family? If you help mom, if you cross apex, what happens to your wife and kids? The question hung in the air like a sword. David had spent years building a life around his apex salary, his company health insurance, his position in the community. Crossing them would mean losing everything he'd worked for. But as he looked around the room, at his mother, whom he'd spent 15 years hating based on lies, at his sister, whose children might be drinking contaminated water, at the evidence spread across the coffee table showing decades of corporate murder, something fundamental shifted in his expression. "Sarah, what happens to my kids if I don't help?" he asked quietly. "What happens to them if we let this continue?" He pulled out his phone, scrolling through contacts. "There's someone else who might help. Maria Santos. She works in Apex's legal department. She's mentioned things, asked questions about why certain lawsuits always get settled out of court with sealed records." "Can you trust her?" Rivera asked. "I don't know. But she has 2 children in Millfield Elementary, same school where the highest rates of birth defects are clustered." David's voice grew stronger. "If anyone has motivation to see this exposed, it's parents who are watching their children get sick." Amanda was taking notes rapidly. "This is good. We're building a network of insider sources, people with different types of access. Mrs. Chen, your husband was right. You're the outsider who can coordinate this without triggering their internal security." Celia felt a strange sense of completion, as if pieces of herself that had been scattered for 15 years were finally coming together. "Then we move forward. Carefully, but we move forward." "What's our timeline?" Sarah asked. Rivera's expression was grim. "The longer we wait, the more time they have to discover what we're doing and stop us. But if we move too fast, we make mistakes that invalidate the evidence." 2 weeks, Amanda said decisively. "I need 2 weeks to verify sources, build the story framework, and find a publication outlet that can't be intimidated or bought." David nodded. "I can get current monitoring data in that time frame without raising suspicions. And I'll approach Maria carefully, see if she's willing to provide legal documentation." As they prepared to leave Sarah's house, Celia felt the weight of command settling on her shoulders. For the first time in 15 years, she had a purpose that felt worthy of the risks involved. Bobby had died protecting this evidence, believing that someday she would have the courage to use it. Thomas Mitchell's surveillance network was closing in. Apex's influence reached into every level of government, and the forces arrayed against them had unlimited resources. But they also had something Apex couldn't buy or intimidate: the simple, powerful desire to protect their children and their community from corporate poison. The war for Millfield's future was about to begin. The escalation began 3 days after their meeting at Sarah's house. James Rivera arrived at his office Monday morning to find his front door kicked in, filing cabinets overturned, and 15 years of environmental research scattered across the floor like confetti. The message was clear. "We know where you work, we know what you're doing, and we can destroy everything you've built." But it was the photograph left on his desk that made his blood run cold. A picture of him entering Sarah's house, taken with a telephoto lens that captured not just his face, but the license plates of every car in the driveway. They knew about the alliance. "Professional job," the police officer noted, surveying the destruction with the detached interest of someone who'd seen similar break-ins before. No fingerprints, no witnesses. Probably kids looking for electronics to sell. Rivera didn't bother correcting him. In a town where Apex Industries employed half the police force's relatives, certain conversations were pointless. An hour later, Amanda Torres called from her apartment near the university, her voice tight with controlled fear. "Dr. Rivera, someone broke into my place last night. They didn't take anything valuable. Laptop, camera equipment, all still here. But they went through every file, every notebook, every piece of research I've collected on Apex. Are you hurt?" "No, but they left something behind." She paused, and Rivera could hear papers rustling. "Printouts of my student loan documents, my lease agreement, my parents' address in Phoenix, and a note that just says, 'Some stories aren't worth the cost.'" Rivera felt the familiar chill of corporate intimidation, the same tactics that had destroyed his career 15 years earlier. "Amanda, you need to leave town. Today." "I'm not running." "This proves we're onto something important." This proves they're willing to hurt you to stop us. But the most devastating blow came that afternoon, when Sarah called Celia with news that made her legs give out. "Mom, I need you to sit down." Sarah's voice was shaking. Emma and Jake were walking home from school today when a car pulled up beside them. A man got out and approached Emma, she's only 8, Mom, and told her to give her grandmother a message. Celia's hands trembled as she gripped the phone. "What message?" "He said that old ladies who ask too many questions sometimes forget to look both ways when crossing the street." Sarah was crying now. "Mom, they threaten my children. They know where my kids go to school." The rage that swept through Celia was unlike anything she'd experienced in 15 years. These people had destroyed her marriage, poisoned her community, and now they were threatening her grandchildren. The fear that had paralyzed her since Bobby's death transformed into something harder, more focused. "Sarah, take the children and go to your in-laws in Pittsburgh. Today. I'm not leaving you to face this alone. You're not leaving me. You're protecting my grandchildren, so I can do what needs to be done." That evening, the core team gathered in Elena's law office after hours, the blinds drawn and the door locked. Elena had been receiving pressure too. Phone calls from Apex's corporate attorneys threatening malpractice suits, hints that her other clients might find new representation if she continued interfering with legitimate business interests. "They're trying to isolate us," Rivera said, reviewing the day's incidents. "Standard corporate warfare. Apply pressure to everyone in our network until we're too afraid or too alone to continue." David arrived late, his face ashen. "It's worse than intimidation. Maria Santos called me this afternoon. She was fired from Apex's legal department this morning. Restructuring, they called it. But she managed to grab something before security escorted her out." He placed a thumb drive on Elena's desk. "Current water quality reports. The ones that are supposed to go to state regulators but somehow never get filed." Amanda plugged the drive into her laptop, her fingers flying over the keyboard. "Jesus. Look at these mercury levels. They're off the charts. And these are from last week." Elena studied the data over Amanda's shoulder. "This proves ongoing contamination. If we can get this to the right authorities." "What authorities?" David's voice was bitter. "Mom, I've been thinking about Dad's files, about the officials who were supposedly investigating 15 years ago. Half of them are still in the same positions, still taking Apex's money." Celia felt the weight of Bobby's final video message, his warning about how deep the corruption ran. "Then we go around them. Amanda, what about your journalism contacts? Is there someone outside the local system who can break this story?" "I've been working on that. There's an investigative team at the Washington Post that specializes in environmental crimes. But they'll need ironclad documentation, chain of custody, verified sources, legal authentication." Rivera pulled up Bobby's video files on his laptop. "We have Bobby's testimony, recorded in his own words. We have 15 years of internal documents. We have current contamination data proving ongoing crimes. But do we have enough to survive the legal and public relations war Apex will launch the moment we go public?" Elena's question hung in the air like a sword. The answer came from an unexpected source. David's phone buzzed with a text that made his face go white. "It's from Thomas Mitchell. He wants to see me in his office tomorrow morning. Says it's about family loyalty and making sure everyone understands their obligations." "It's a trap," Amanda said immediately. "Maybe. Or maybe it's an opportunity." David's voice was stronger than it had been all evening. "Mom, they're threatening children now. My nephew and niece. Kids who've never hurt anyone, who don't even understand what's happening." He looked around the room at faces marked by fear and determination. "What if I wear a wire? What if we get Mitchell on record threatening me, trying to buy my silence?" Elena shook her head. "David, that's incredibly dangerous. If they find recording equipment, then I'll be another tragic accident, like all the others. But if I don't try, if we don't fight back, then Emma and Jake grow up drinking poisoned water, while the people responsible get richer." Celia studied her son's face, seeing for the first time in 15 years the boy who'd once believed his parents could fix anything. David, I can't ask you to. You're not asking. I'm volunteering. His voice carried the same determination she remembered from Bobby in their early days fighting environmental cases. Mom, I've spent 15 years hating you for something you didn't do. I've worked for a company that's been slowly murdering our neighbors. I can't live with that anymore. Rivera was already considering the technical aspects. If we're going to do this, we need professional equipment. Something small enough to avoid detection, but powerful enough to get clear audio. I know someone, Amanda said quietly. An investigative journalist who covers organized crime. He's got equipment designed for exactly this kind of situation. Elena pulled out a legal pad, her attorney's mind organizing the strategy. If David gets Mitchell on tape admitting to criminal activity, threatening witnesses, or acknowledging the cover-up, it becomes evidence of ongoing conspiracy. Combined with Bobby's files and the current contamination data, it might be enough to force federal intervention. And if it goes wrong? Sarah's question came through the speakerphone from Pittsburgh, where she'd taken her children to safety. The silence stretched until Celia spoke, her voice carrying the weight of 15 years of grief and rage. Then at least we'll have tried. At least Bobby's sacrifice will have meant something. As they finalized plans for David's confrontation with Thomas Mitchell, Celia felt the ghosts of her old life finally being laid to rest. The woman who'd fled her marriage rather than fight, who'd accepted exile rather than demand answers, who'd let fear make her choices. That woman was gone. In her place stood someone Bobby would have recognized, the environmental lawyer who'd once believed that justice was worth any risk, that protecting the innocent justified any sacrifice. Tomorrow, David would walk into Thomas Mitchell's office wearing a wire, carrying the hopes of an entire community and the weight of his family's redemption. And whatever happened next, Celia Chen was finally ready to see it through to the end. The recording device was smaller than a quarter, designed to look like a shirt button and transmit to receivers within a half-mile radius. David stood in Elena's law office at 7 a.m, letting Amanda's journalist contact, a grizzled investigative reporter named Frank Walsh, test the equipment one final time. Remember, Frank said, adjusting the tiny transmitter, don't try to force admissions. Let Mitchell talk. Powerful men like him can't resist explaining how clever they are when they think they're in control. Celia watched her son prepare for what might be the most dangerous conversation of his life, seeing courage in his face that reminded her of Bobby in their early days fighting corporate polluters. 15 years of bitterness had stripped away between them in the past week, replaced by something stronger, the shared determination to protect their family. David, she said quietly, if Mitchell becomes suspicious, if you sense any danger, I'll abort. I know, Mom. He straightened his tie, the same nervous gesture he'd made as a child before school presentations. But we need this. We need him on record. Thomas Mitchell's office occupied the top floor of Apex Industries' corporate headquarters, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of Millfield's industrial landscape. At 62, Mitchell still carried himself like the military officer he'd once been, his silver hair precisely cut, his handshake firm enough to make a point. David, good to see you. Coffee? Please. David accepted the cup, noting how Mitchell's secretary closed the door and remained outside. The office was designed to intimidate. Awards from environmental organizations that were probably fraudulent, photographs with politicians whose campaigns Apex had funded, diplomas from prestigious schools that validated Mitchell's authority. I wanted to discuss your family situation, Mitchell began, settling behind his massive desk. Specifically, your mother's recent activities. What activities? David kept his voice neutral, though his heart was racing. Mitchell smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. David, we've been monitoring electronic communications, tracking financial transactions, observing behavioral patterns. Your mother has been quite busy since your father's funeral. Through the hidden receiver, Celia listened to every word from Rivera's car parked 3 blocks away. Elena sat beside her, taking notes, while Amanda monitored the recording equipment. I'm not sure what you mean, David replied, though he knew evasion was pointless. Your mother inherited some materials from your father. Computer files, documents, data that belongs to Apex Industries. We need those materials returned. Belongs to Apex? They were Dad's personal files. Mitchell's laugh was harsh. Personal? David, Your father was downloading proprietary information for years. Internal reports, confidential communications, sensitive environmental data. What he was doing was corporate espionage. Through the radio connection, Celia felt her breath catch. Mitchell was admitting that Bobby had been stealing information, but not denying that the information was accurate. Corporate espionage? David pushed. Dad was an environmental engineer. Wasn't he supposed to have access to environmental data? Not the data he was collecting. Not the communications between executives and regulatory officials. Not the financial records showing legal settlement costs. Mitchell's voice hardened. Your father was building a case against this company, David. Against me, personally. In the car, Elena whispered. He's confessing to a conspiracy. Keep pushing, David. As if hearing her thoughts, David leaned forward. A case for what? What was Dad trying to prove? Mitchell stood and walked to his window, looking out at the industrial complex that had made him wealthy. Your father believed we were responsible for environmental damage in Millfield. Birth defects, cancer clusters, water contamination. He thought Apex was liable for conditions that have existed in industrial communities for generations. And are we? Are we liable? The silence stretched for 30 seconds. When Mitchell finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of years of justification. David, do you know what this company means to Millfield? We employ 3,000 people directly, support another 5,000 jobs indirectly. We generate 40% of the county's tax revenue. We fund the hospital, the schools, the community center. That doesn't answer my question, doesn't it? Mitchell turned back to face him. Every industrial process involves risk. Every manufacturing operation produces waste. The question isn't whether there are environmental impacts. The question is whether those impacts are an acceptable cost for the economic benefits we provide. David felt sick. Acceptable to whom? To the families whose children are born with birth defects? To the community as a whole? To the thousands of families who depend on Apex for their livelihoods? Mitchell's voice grew colder. Your father lost sight of that balance. He became obsessed with theoretical harm while ignoring practical benefits. Theoretical harm? David's anger was breaking through his careful composure. My nephew and niece live in Millfield. My sister's children drink the same water, which is why we need your cooperation. Mitchell returned to his desk, pulling out a folder. David, your father's actions put your entire family at risk. Not from us. From federal investigators, environmental activists, media attention that could destroy lives. He opened the folder, revealing photographs. Celia entering Elena's law office. Rivera and Amanda at the diner. Sarah's children walking to school. We know about the meetings. We know about the collaboration with Dr. Rivera and the journalist. We know your mother is planning to go public with information that could trigger a federal investigation costing thousands of jobs. David stared at the surveillance photos, understanding finally how deep Mitchell's network reached. You've been watching my family for weeks. We've been protecting your family for years. Do you think it's coincidence that your children attend the best schools in the district? That they've never experienced health problems related to environmental factors? Do you think your sister's family just happened to avoid the cancer clusters in their neighborhood? The implication hit David like a physical blow. You've been, what? Providing clean water to specific families? We've been managing risk, David. Making sure that people important to us, people whose loyalty we value, receive certain considerations. Mitchell's smile was genuinely warm now, as if he was discussing employee benefits rather than selective poisoning. Your father's files contain information that could end those protections for your family. In the car, Celia was crying silently, understanding for the first time the full scope of Bobby's sacrifice. He'd known that leaving Apex would mean losing protection for his family, would mean watching his grandchildren drink the same contaminated water as everyone else. So what do you want from me? David asked. Simple. Convince your mother to return the files. All of them. In exchange, your family remains under our protection. Your job is secure. Your children stay healthy. Mitchell leaned back in his chair. Refuse, and we withdraw all protections. Your family becomes just another casualty of industrial progress. David stood slowly, his mind racing. The man across from him had just confessed to systematic poisoning, to selective protection of favored families, to surveillance and intimidation tactics. All of it recorded, all of it admissible in court. I need time to think about this. Of course. But David, don't take too long. Your father waited 15 years to act on his conscience. Look how that ended for him. The threat was unmistakable. As David left Mitchell's office, his legs barely carried him to the elevator. In the lobby, he passed workers arriving for their shifts, people who had no idea they were employed by a company that viewed their health as an acceptable sacrifice for profit. Outside, Rivera's car was waiting. David got in without speaking, his hands shaking as Amanda helped him remove the recording equipment. "Did you get it?" he finally asked. Elena was already reviewing the audio on her laptop. "We got everything. Admission of environmental damage, confession to selective protection schemes, threats against your family, and acknowledgement of a conspiracy to cover up health impacts." Celia reached over and took her son's hand. "David, I'm so proud of you. Your father would be proud." "Would he?" David's voice was hollow. "Mom, Mitchell was right about one thing. Exposing this will destroy thousands of jobs. Families will lose their homes, their insurance, their futures. And if we don't expose it, children will keep being born with birth defects. Families will keep losing loved ones to preventable cancers, and an entire community will continue being slowly murdered for corporate profit." Celia replied firmly. She looked around the car at faces marked by exhaustion and determination. "Bobby spent 15 years carrying this burden alone because he thought he was protecting us. Now we know the truth. There is no protection from evil except exposing it to the light." Amanda was already uploading the recording to secure servers. "Mrs. Chen, with this evidence combined with your husband's files, we have everything we need to take down Apex Industries. The question is whether we're ready for the war they're going to wage against us." Celia thought of her grandchildren in Pittsburgh, of Bobby's final video message, of 15 years of guilt and separation that could finally be redeemed through justice. "Let them come," she said quietly. "We have the truth on our side. And sometimes, that's enough." The war began at dawn. Celia woke to her phone buzzing incessantly. Text messages, missed calls, voicemails that painted a picture of coordinated retaliation. Elena's law office had received an anonymous tip about tax irregularities, triggering an IRS audit. Rivera's research funding had been mysteriously suspended, pending a review of his credentials. Amanda's editor had killed the Apex story, citing insufficient corroboration. But Mitchell had made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated the power of Bobby's network. 15 years is a long time to build relationships, Elena explained during their emergency meeting at Rivera's house. Her laptop showed a web of connections Bobby had cultivated. Former EPA officials, environmental lawyers in other states, investigative journalists who owed him favors from previous exposés. "Your husband was playing a longer game than any of us realized," she continued. "Every person he helped, every case he contributed to anonymously, every young scientist he mentored, he was building an army." The recording of David's conversation with Mitchell had already been duplicated and distributed to a dozen secure locations. But more importantly, Bobby's files contained contact information for sources throughout the industrial pollution network. People who had been waiting years for someone to coordinate a broader attack. Dr. Sarah Kim called from Pittsburgh with unexpected news. "Mom, the Children's Hospital here just received an anonymous donation to fund a comprehensive study of birth defects in former industrial communities. The donor specifically requested they start with Millfield." Amanda's phone rang next. Another journalist, this one from Chicago, asking if she was the reporter working on the Apex Industries story. Then another from Atlanta, then Los Angeles. "How do they know?" Amanda asked, but Elena was already smiling. "Bobby's network. He spent 15 years documenting similar cases in dozens of cities. When we go public with Apex, we're not just exposing one company. We're launching coordinated investigations into an entire system of industrial poisoning." Rivera spread out maps showing contamination patterns across 3 states. "Look at this. Apex isn't unique. They're part of a model that's been replicated everywhere. Same playbook. Capture regulatory officials, selectively protect politically important families, sacrifice everyone else. The scope of Bobby's vision was breathtaking. He hadn't just been collecting evidence against Apex. He'd been mapping a nationwide conspiracy of corporate environmental crime. Celia stared at her husband's masterpiece, understanding finally why he'd carried such weight for so many years. He wasn't just trying to save Millfield. He was trying to save everyone. David arrived with disturbing news from Apex. Mitchell called an all-hands meeting. He's announcing plant expansions, new jobs, increased community investment. He's trying to make himself indispensable before we go public. Classic corporate crisis management, Elena observed. Make the economic cost of exposure seem catastrophic. But Amanda was monitoring social media, watching a different story unfold. It's not working. People in Millfield are starting to ask questions. Someone leaked that David was seen entering Mitchell's office yesterday. The rumor mill is connecting dots. Local Facebook groups buzzed with speculation. Families were comparing notes about health problems, about which neighborhoods seemed mysteriously spared from the worst contamination. The protective conspiracy that had seemed so powerful was beginning to crack under the weight of community suspicion. Mitchell's phone call came at noon. Mrs. Chen, his voice was carefully controlled. I believe we need to meet. I don't think so, Mr. Mitchell. Your son made some very serious accusations yesterday. For his sake, for your family's sake, I hope you'll reconsider your current course of action. Celia looked around the room at faces that had become family over the past week. Elena with her fierce protective instincts, Rivera with his scientist's commitment to truth, Amanda with her journalist's hunger for justice, David with his father's growing courage. Mr. Mitchell, my husband spent 15 years trying to find a way to expose your crimes without destroying this community. He died believing he'd failed. She paused, feeling Bobby's presence in the room. But he didn't fail. He built something bigger than Apex Industries. Bigger than your threats. Bigger than your money. Mrs. Chen. The story goes live tomorrow morning, simultaneously in 12 cities, with coordinated federal complaints in 6 states. Your war isn't with my family anymore, Mr. Mitchell. It's with the truth. She hung up and looked at Bobby's photograph on Rivera's mantle. Rest easy, my love. Your work is done. Outside, Millfield was waking up to its last day of ignorance. Tomorrow, everything would change. At 6 a.m. Eastern, the first story went live. Toxic Legacy, how industrial giant poisoned community for decades, appeared simultaneously on 12 news websites across the country. Amanda's byline led the investigation, but she shared credit with journalists in Detroit, Birmingham, Phoenix, cities where similar patterns of selective protection and systematic poisoning had been documented. By 7 a.m., the phones at Apex Industries were ringing constantly. By 8 a.m., CNN was running breaking news alerts. By 9 a.m., federal marshals were arriving at Mitchell's office with search warrants. Celia watched the coverage from Rivera's living room, surrounded by the people who had become her chosen family. The audio recording of David's conversation with Mitchell played on every major network, his confession echoing across airwaves that reached millions. Every industrial process involves risk. The question is whether those impacts are an acceptable cost for the economic benefits we provide. We've been managing risk, making sure that people important to us receive certain considerations. Your family becomes just another casualty of industrial progress. Sarah called from Pittsburgh, crying with relief. Mom, they're already testing the water at Emma's school. The EPA is sending a team to every location mentioned in Dad's files. David arrived looking shaken. I've been fired, of course. But half the Apex workforce walked out this morning when they learned about the Selective Protection Program. People are realizing their own children were being poisoned while executives' families were kept safe. Elena's phone buzzed with updates from other lawyers in Bobby's network. Class action suits are being filed in 6 states. The Department of Justice is opening a criminal investigation. Mitchell's been arrested on federal conspiracy charges. But the most powerful moment came when Mrs. Rodriguez from the diner appeared on the news, holding a photograph of her granddaughter who had been born with birth defects. "We always wondered why some families never seemed to get sick," she said to the reporter. "Now we know. They were protecting their friends and letting our babies suffer." How do you forgive something like that? Amanda was fielding calls from producers, publishers, documentarians. "Bobby's story is becoming a symbol," she told Celia. "One man's 15-year fight against corporate evil. They want to know everything about him." Celia looked at her husband's photograph, remembering the quiet, brilliant man who had carried such enormous weight for so long. Tell them he was a father who couldn't stand watching children suffer. Tell them he was a scientist who believed truth was more powerful than money. Tell them he was the bravest person I ever knew. As evening fell over Millfield, protesters gathered outside Apex Industries' gates. Not angry mobs demanding jobs, as Mitchell had predicted, but families demanding justice. Signs read, "Our children matter too," and "Bobby Chen was right." Rivera raised a glass of wine. To Bobby. He saved more lives than he ever knew. They toasted quietly as the sun set over a transformed community. Tomorrow would bring trials, investigations, long fights for compensation and cleanup. But today, the truth had won. Outside, Millfield was finally free. 2 years later, the Bobby Chen Environmental Justice Center occupied the top 3 floors of what had once been Apex Industries' corporate headquarters. Celia stood in the conference room that had been Thomas Mitchell's office, watching her granddaughter Emma present her science fair project to a panel of EPA officials. "My grandfather believed that clean water was a human right," 8-year-old Emma explained, pointing to her display about water filtration systems. "He died trying to prove that companies can't poison children just to make money." The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. The building that had once housed the conspiracy to poison Millfield now served as a training center for environmental lawyers, a research facility for industrial contamination, and a coordination hub for communities fighting corporate pollution nationwide. Mitchell himself was serving 15 years in federal prison, his conviction on conspiracy and environmental terrorism charges making headlines that Bobby's quiet sacrifice never had. Apex Industries had been dissolved, its assets liquidated to fund the largest environmental cleanup and victim compensation program in American history. But the real victory wasn't in the courtroom or the cleanup. It was in the transformation of how America thought about environmental justice. Dr. Rivera, now director of the center's research division, joined Celia at the window overlooking Millfield's industrial district. Where toxic waste lagoons had once festered, wetlands were being restored. Where smokestacks had belched poison, solar arrays gleamed in the afternoon sun. "Bobby would be amazed," Rivera said. 73 communities have used his model to expose similar conspiracies. The Selective Protection Program wasn't unique to Apex. It was standard practice across dozens of industries. Elena emerged from the courtroom where she'd just finished arguing another case inspired by Bobby's files. The pharmaceutical company in Oregon just agreed to a settlement. Full cleanup, medical monitoring for affected families, and criminal referrals for the executives who knew about the contamination. Amanda had won a Pulitzer Prize for her Apex investigation, but she'd turned down offers from major networks to stay focused on the work Bobby had started. Her book, The 15-Year War, had become required reading in journalism schools and environmental law programs. "I got a call from a community in Texas," she told the group. "Chemical plant, birth defects, families getting sick while executives stay healthy. They want to know if Bobby's model can work there too." The Bobby Chen model had become shorthand for a systematic approach to exposing environmental crime. Meticulous documentation, network building, coordinated media campaigns, and federal law enforcement partnerships. Universities taught courses on it. Activists studied it. Corporate lawyers feared it. David had found his calling as the center's community outreach coordinator, helping other families navigate the complex process of fighting industrial pollution. His experience wearing a wire into Mitchell's office had made him a powerful advocate for other whistleblowers. "The hardest part isn't the danger," he often told groups. "It's living with the knowledge that every day you delay, more children are being hurt." Sarah had moved back to Millfield with her family, her medical expertise now focused on treating the health effects of environmental contamination. The children's hospital Bobby had dreamed about was under construction, funded by the Apex settlement and designed specifically to address the long-term health impacts of industrial poisoning. But perhaps the most meaningful change was in how Millfield remembered Bobby himself. The quiet engineer who had died, thinking himself a failure, was now honored with a statue in the town square, a scholarship program at the local high school, and an annual environmental science award that drew applicants from around the world. Children who had never met him knew his story, understood that one person's conscience could change the world. Celia walked through the center's halls, past photographs documenting Bobby's 15-year investigation, past displays showing the communities that had been helped by his work, past offices where young lawyers and scientists continued the fight he'd started. In her own office, the one that had once belonged to Mitchell's secretary, she kept Bobby's final video message playing on a loop, not for visitors but for herself, as a daily reminder of what love looked like when faced with impossible choices. "I'm sorry I couldn't find a way to do this without hurting people. I'm sorry I couldn't be braver sooner. But maybe someday, when the truth comes out, you'll understand that everything I did was to protect the children. All the children, not just our own." She understood now. Bobby hadn't failed. He'd succeeded beyond anything he could have imagined. His careful documentation had exposed not just one company's crimes, but an entire system of environmental injustice. His network had become a movement. His sacrifice had become a symbol. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. Another community, another company, another group of families realizing they were being systematically poisoned, while their neighbors stayed mysteriously healthy. "Bobby Chen Environmental Justice Center," she answered. "How can we help?" As she listened to the familiar story, children with birth defects, adults with cancer, executives whose families never seemed to get sick, Celia felt her husband's presence in the room. Not as a ghost haunting her grief, but as a partner continuing their shared work. Outside her window, Millfield's children played in parks that were finally safe, drank water that was finally clean, breathed air that was finally pure. In communities across America, other children were beginning to experience the same freedom. Bobby's war was over. His victory was just beginning. The truth, as Celia had promised Thomas Mitchell 2 years ago, had been enough. It was always enough, when people were brave enough to fight for it. She picked up her pen and began taking notes. There was work to do. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.